This week, I want to talk about revolution for agency, and that requires some explanation because it does start with where we left off last week in a very precise sense, with the emergence of a conception of conscience, especially as sharpened by the contribution of Jonathan Edwards. You'll remember that Edwards had picked up from his Puritan heritage the idea that conscience needed to be seen as the image and resemblance of God, because that was how it was possible for an individual to understand God and to relate to God. It was for that reason that we began only then, within our series, to speak of revolution as for something, as in a direction. And Jonathan Edwards himself realized this in a quotation that I gave last time, and I haven't put on the sheet this time, but I'll just briefly revisit it, because it is the pivot of this idea of revolution toward. God, Jonathan Edwards wrote, is continually causing revolutions. Providence makes a continual progress and continually is bringing forth things new in the state of the world and very different from whatever were expected of it. And the reason he says this is possible is because of the availability of spirit in a fresh way. But that also implies that the revolution for needs inevitably to go beyond the issue of conscience alone. The awareness that change as positive revolution is something that must take place implies that human beings have the agency in order to take part in precisely that change. Perhaps the best example of this in Jonathan Edwards' own life was his own alteration of his attitude towards slavery, since he had started as someone who approved of the institution, took it for granted along with others in 18th century New England, and came to oppose it. But slavery is one of those elements within social life where conscience cannot rest simply by making a decision. If I live in a slave society, the fact that I myself do not own slaves is insufficient. Something further is demanded of that. That also is a part of this image and resemblance to God, which means that human beings can take part in that change as agents of the revolution. And it's interesting that within this same century as Edwards, writing near the time of Edwards, precisely these connections were being made by another thinker. This is the first one listed on the handout, namely John Woolman. Woolman grew up and was active in what are today New Jersey and Pennsylvania. New Brunswick was really his center of operation, though he lived in several different places, even before he became a programmatic traveler. But at first, he was simply an apprentice clerk in a local shop. And as a clerk, he was asked to do a variety of things. He would have to draw up orders for what kind of disposition would be made of grain inside the store, bills of sale, and in that ordinary work, he was also asked to do the transfer document for the sale of a slave. And because it was a part of his routine work, he did it. And then thereafter, began to feel regret that he had done it, and to ask himself whether he was really capable of doing that again. And when the occasion again arose, he then decided as a matter of conscience that he would not sign the bill of sale, that he personally could not take part in the institution. Didn't matter whether he was owning a slave or not. That was not an issue. He didn't have enough wealth for the occasion to arise. But he would not take part in the institution itself. As he did this, he also kept a diary. And his diary or journal, published towards the end of his life, gave a map for how it is that slavery should be resisted as an institution. And what's fascinating about his entire journal is that at each moment that woman takes another step against slavery, and I'll go on to explain those steps in a moment, he is reading from the Revelation to John. He's reading from the Apocalypse, and he's not reading it as a map of what is going to happen in the distant future. He's reading it exactly as Jonathan Edwards and Isaac Newton read it, namely as showing how it is that God's Spirit operates for and against certain institutions. And so the particular excerpt we're going to look at occurs when he's referring to reading from the description of the New Jerusalem in the Revelation to John, a place where there's going to be available both the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. What's very interesting is that the last book of the New Testament, in a key area, reverses what happens in the book of Genesis. At the beginning of the book of Genesis, people are excluded from the garden because they've eaten of the tree of knowledge, right? And that story is used to explain why we are the way we are. Namely, why is it people have to work? They're excluded from the garden. Why is it women have pain in childbirth? They're excluded from the garden. Why don't snakes have legs? Excluded from the garden. It's all part of the curse of knowledge. Why do we have troubling knowledge? We should never have eaten the fruit. And Yahweh in the story decided to throw us out of the garden because he knew that once we'd eaten of the tree of knowledge, we might then eat of the tree of life. Then we'd live as long as God. So it is a jealousy of divine power that makes Yahweh exclude people from the garden. I'm not defending their behavior, but I am saying that Yahweh is also portrayed in anthropomorphic terms as someone who is profoundly jealous of his own status and wants to assure that it remains unique. Which is why it is all the more fascinating that at the close of the Revelation, in the New Jerusalem, there is the tree of life, and there's the tree of knowledge. And people enjoy them both, and God enjoys them enjoying them both. So for Woolman, you're talking about a different understanding of humanity altogether, which he believed you can already enjoy an understanding of. And so he writes, "And in reading it, my mind was drawn to seek after and long for that pure habitation, which I then believed God had prepared for his servants. The place where I sat and the sweetness that attended my mind remains fresh in my memory." And periodically, all the way through the journal, he will speak of similar experiences while he's reading from the Revelation, sometimes of a visionary nature, always causing him to become more and more active in his personal campaign through Quaker meetings against slavery. And as he's speaking out against slavery, traveling wherever he could go, chiefly in the Middle States and in the Northeast, he also observes other behaviors which in his opinion were akin to slavery. If, for example, a person is wearing a gold ornament, where did the gold come from? How was it acquired? What were the working conditions of the people who mined for it? Perhaps it is better not to wear jewelry at all. Maybe we should simply avoid that, and in living more simply, provide more justice generally. So his campaign against slavery was steadily widening. It's as if it were putting into action what Edwards said about continuous revolutions. He kept pressing outward and became extremely well recognized as a speaker, especially in Quaker meetings, and was invited to London to speak to the annual meeting of the Quakers. They knew what they were getting. They wanted someone who would speak against slavery, and that was John Woolman. So Woolman shows up at the ship in order to go to London and discovers that his supporters have provided for him first-class accommodation. So he refuses it. And he insists that he wants to cross the Atlantic in steerage with the apprentices on board, because he believes that they have been unjustly impressed and he wants to be with them during the voyage. So he travels to London. He gave that address. The result of that was that the English Quakers became a formidable force against slavery, both against the slave trade and against owning slavery. It took until the next century for that to unfold, but the Quakers early on took the position, and Woolman, being Woolman, continued teaching and preaching while he was in England. He was feeling a bit woozy, but he often felt a bit woozy. Got himself all the way up to the city of York, where it turns out that his wooziness was because in steerage he had contracted smallpox, from which he died in York. I'm glad at least it's a lovely city. But his life actually illustrates exactly this principle that Edwards had been referring to, and his take on the Revelation influenced, of all people, William Blake. Because Blake also turns out to be fixated, and it's not too strong a word, I think, fixated on the revelation to John as an instrument of current experience, which tells us about the state that we should be moving towards. And he believed this was the case because within the revelation to John, time, as usually counted, simply dissolves. And that's why he wrote in his poem, Milton, every time less than the pulsation of the artery is equal in its period and value to 6,000 years. Why 6,000 years? Because the Puritan understanding had been that the earth was made 6,000 years ago. You may, by the way, have heard that calculation among creationists to this present day. And that is because they're using the understanding of when creation happened that had been devised by Joseph Mead during the course of the 17th century and was then promulgated by Parliament. It was once virtually law in England that you understand that the Earth is 6,000 years old and is about to come towards its end. But Blake, like Edwards and like Newton, is saying these 6,000 years are to be taken symbolically because we ourselves experience them in the infinitesimal time it takes for your heart to beat and to make a pulse in the artery. The world's experience is recapitulated in your experience, and you have the capacity then to add to that experience and to move the world towards completion. And when Blake speaks of this completion, it is in terms of exactly the same passage that John Woolman referred to. A fact that had been well known because Woolman's work was better regarded in England than it was in the United States. Charles Lamb once said, "It is the only American book I have ever liked," which I guess, coming from a Brit, is praise, I'm not sure. So it was extremely well known. Blake refers to it, and he writes of this same New Jerusalem, "Thus shall the male and female live in the life of eternity, because the Lamb of God creates himself a bride and wife, that we his children evermore may live in Jerusalem, which now descendeth out of heaven, a city, yet a woman, mother of myriads, redeemed and born in her spiritual palaces, by a new spiritual birth, regenerated from death." It is clear that Blake is also a reader of Jonathan Edwards. In fact, in his other poetry, he refers to Edwards, he refers to George Whitefield, another figure within the Great Awakening of the 18th century. Blake also understands this as being an awakening, but precisely in the sense of Jonathan Edwards, towards a view of conscience that causes a commitment to one's own agency. And Blake here and elsewhere deliberately attributes that agency to women as well as to men, because this is also the period in the 19th century when there is continued discussion not only of widening the right to vote from men who own property to men who may not own property, but even to women, on the argument that as human beings, women are also agents. They are not only capable of conscience, but they can act on the basis of that conscience. The same argument which would say an awareness of yourself as having conscience means that you understand that a slave has conscience and therefore should be free, also implies that as a woman has conscience, she should have liberties that are the equivalent that men have. But this was not exactly an easy sell during the 19th century. And there remain, as you might say, pockets of resistance. In England itself, and I'll refer to this just before my reference to Walter Rauschenbusch on the next page, in England itself, many of these understandings of human agency against slavery, against oppressive economic institutions, against an oppressive attitude towards women, were taken up by a theologian whose name was Frederick Denison Morris, also sometimes simply referred to as F.D. Morris. He was trained at Trinity College in Cambridge and then ultimately took up an academic position at the University of London. He lived through the great revolutions of 1848, and those revolutions taught him, as far as he was concerned, that the people of his time needed to come to a basic insight, namely that industrialism had proven that a strictly capitalist ordering of society was inherently unjust, that there had to be a socialist understanding in which property was not seen as being the primary virtue. For that reason, he set about in London, while he had his chair for teaching, a series of cooperative industries, and he felt in all of this work it was vital that education should receive its due, including for people who ordinarily could not receive an education. And so he set up colleges for men and for women, and in doing so he set up what he called the Christian Socialist Movement, in which he made two arguments. One was that any intelligent reading of the New Testament comes to the conclusion that property cannot be regarded as king, namely that the New Testament itself tends in a socialist direction. And he also believed that there could be no attainment of a socialist society without there being a religious basis of the movement, because he felt you needed something to resist the appeal of greed, which will always work for industrial capitalism. And so he founded the movement, and of course he was promptly fired by the University of London, which saw him as a threat to a status quo which profited them. I've been delighted to see that the University of London has done penance and now sponsors an annual F.D. Morris lecture. Isn't it wonderful? Now that they can fundraise off him, he's welcome back. His life did not end badly. He went back to Cambridge, but unfortunately it meant that the work he was putting together in the urban setting of London, he could not personally attend to in the way in which he wished. But others read him. And the Christian socialist movement of the 19th century was an important aspect of reform behind the vote for women, behind child labor laws, behind the passing of laws for general public education, which had not yet been achieved until the end of the 19th century, and for other kinds of social change. These were all put together by the Baptist minister, Walter Rauschenbusch, who was primarily active in the exotic setting of Brooklyn. And in Brooklyn, his churches became powerhouses of exactly the kind of institution that F.D. Morris had been talking about. In addition, because Walter Rauschenbusch was a Baptist, there was no bishop to fire him. He did not belong to a university popular in his church, and therefore he went on and prospered in that setting until towards the end of his career, and it must be said, total exhaustion. He was a very committed figure. He went to Rochester and there taught at a Baptist seminary until the close of his life. And the way in which Rauschenbusch put his entire position in a book called Christianity and the Social Crisis, which was published, as you see, in 1908, encapsulates the movement that he himself called the social gospel. That is, the understanding that the gospel as taught by Christ was not only or even principally a message that concerned what you should believe, it also turned on the question of what you should do, how you should behave, how you treat others, how you value yourself in relation to others. And the way in which Rauschenbusch puts this, I think, also shows very clearly that he had read his Jonathan Edwards very carefully. That's why I repeated that quotation at the beginning of my remarks this afternoon. So Rauschenbusch wrote, "The modern emancipation of the intellectual life began in the Renaissance of the 15th century and is not finished yet. The modern emancipation of the religious life began in the Reformation of the 16th century and is not finished yet. The modern emancipation of the political life began in the Puritan Revolution of the 17th century and is not finished yet." You see, his history reading is the same as my history reading. I don't pretend to have made this up. The modern emancipation of the industrial life began in the 19th century and is not finished yet. Let us have patience, let us have hope, and above all, let us have faith. So as he saw it, it was in fact possible for the Industrial Revolution to be tamed by the new revolution of the social gospel. The thinking was very much that of F.D. Morris, but now applied within a specifically American setting and in a way which was powerfully influential. We can begin to discuss perhaps afterwards why it is that, having been very influential, why during the 19th century it was perfectly natural to speak of Christian socialism. Today it is treated as if it were an oxymoron. I was just listening to a certain commentator in the United States Senate today who was remarking that he found it somehow ironic that anyone in the United States should be talking about socialism. Really? In the Kentucky, where he comes from, in the 19th century, Christians were speaking about it all the time as being a value system obviously more compatible with the gospel than anything that Adam Smith ever wrote. So it's interesting. There is some kind of pushback, obviously, and I'll come to that issue towards the end of my remarks. But before I do that, I want to refer to what is now, it appears to be, the latest phase of this understanding of an agency of people, which means that they are in a position to take control of the economic situation itself and to humanize that on the basis of their own divine agency. And for this I refer to the movement known usually as liberation theology, which began in South America because South America had experienced some of the worst excesses of a purely capitalist culture, and because, as you will see, there was a critique of the way in which attempts had been made by Western nations, especially the United States, to deal in programs of what were fashionably called development. There was, in particular, a disappointment in South America in John F. Kennedy's Alliance for Progress, on the grounds that it defined progress as whatever the United States said progress was, and resulted in asymmetries in South American culture which appeared to make matters worse. So what is the way forward, if not through development? Gustavo Gutierrez writes in 1970, but in writing in 1970, he really is encapsulating a series of measures which had already been taken by priests and bishops at a national level in South America. And so he writes, in these pages, we are particularly sensitive to the critical function of theology regarding the Church's presence and activity in the world. The principal fact about that presence today, especially in underdeveloped countries, is the participation by Christians in the struggle to construct a just and fraternal society in which men can live in dignity and be masters of their own destinies. We think that the word development does not well express those profound aspirations. Liberation seems more exact and richer in overtones. Besides, it opens up a more fertile field for theological reflection. The problem of development is not only its alienating privilege of profit over people, but the larger frame of how human progress should be measured. Liberation, therefore, seems to express better both the hopes of oppressed peoples and the fullness of a view in which man is not seen as a passive element, but as an agent of history. Gutierrez has precisely understood this revolution for agency. It begins with the recognition that each person has actually been framed by God to effect change. More profoundly, to see history as a process of man's liberation places the issue of desired social changes in a dynamic context. It also permits us to understand better the age we live in. Finally, the term development clouds up somewhat the theological issues latent in the process. To speak of liberation, on the other hand, is to hint at the biblical sources that illuminate man's presence and actions in history. Liberation from sin by Christ our Redeemer, and the bringing of new life. And in order to express that, liberation theologians especially relied on the Exodus story from the Hebrew Bible, which they saw not as a story about Israel and Egypt, but a story of freedom out of oppression. And they also relied in the New Testament on resurrection as a principal symbol that applied not simply to Jesus, but also to the life of humanity. Now, to return to this issue of the pushback that I referred to, liberation theologians were widely silenced by the Vatican. That is, people such as Matthew Fox, who's a good friend of mine, were told by his Dominican order, for 1 year, you shall not speak publicly about liberation theology, or, by the way, anything else. So Matthew was silent for 1 year, and then 1 year and 1 day after that, he spoke again. And at that point, Cardinal Ratzinger, it was Cardinal Ratzinger at that time, explained to him, no, Matthew, this is not what we thought. Ultimately, they expelled him from the Dominican order, they removed him from priesthood, and they excommunicated him. Like F.D. Morris, it wasn't all bad. He went to live in California, where he's now an Episcopalian priest. So it's okay. He still has a basis on which he can teach and reflect. Other liberation theologians who were treated in a similar way continue their ministries, although defrocked and excommunicated. They continue to run churches in South America, and they refuse to give in. But the difficulty about being branded in this way by the papacy is that it also frees local governments to act against liberation theologians. So very famously, Archbishop Romero was killed in his cathedral by machine gun because of his preaching of liberation theology. The action was not condoned by the papacy, but the person the action was taken against had been condemned by the papacy. We do live in what anyone would call interesting times, in the sense that alongside the principles of agency and their underlying revolutions that we have been speaking about, there is also a push against any such thing, which sees revolution in any idiom, economic, political, sexual, as being a threat to civilization in itself. We can't take the time here to talk about the ways in which that too develops out of an ideology of reaction from the 19th century until the present. But for those of you interested in that theme, I'll be talking about this anti-revolutionary theme. You see, it's not really a part of my current topic, but the anti-revolution was also produced by this revolution. And I'll be speaking about that in Rhinebeck at the Reformed Church there at the end of this month. So this is the good news you had today. If you really want the bad news, you can come to the Reformed Church in Rhinebeck. After all, they're the inheritors of the Puritans. Thank you very much indeed. I do have a date, the 28th of April. 28th of April, and they give you a free lunch in Rhinebeck, unlike here. If you want lunch, you come at 12:30, and I always recommend the lunch. It is actually made by someone who works here, a graduate of the Culinary Institute of America, and he surely makes the best soup in this part of the Hudson Valley. So that's 12:30 for lunch. I mean, there are things besides the soup, but that's my favorite. And then the presentation itself begins at 1 o'clock. And then we finish up usually around 2, allowing for questions and discussion, that kind of thing. And at that time, too, we'll be thinking in Rhinebeck about what we should discuss next season. By the way, here, I thought that we would take up a project in the autumn of discussing the very beginnings of prophecy. That is, how prophecy developed, what it did within the biblical materials, starting with the earliest prophecies that there are, but also relating those to religions in the Near East during the same period. But that's logistical. If then there are questions perhaps about today's. Yes, please. Walter Rauschenbusch had an enormous impact not only on American theology, but on American politics. You may spot traces of it in the programs of Theodore Roosevelt, of Woodrow Wilson, and of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In fact, many of the programs put in place by Franklin Roosevelt were knowingly implementations of the social gospel. Above all, social security. I mean, he understood that in particular how people who don't work at the end of their lives are treated is a vitally important social question. And Franklin Roosevelt's attitude towards that was not simply as a political matter. He explicitly understood this as being a religious engagement that was part of his interior purpose. So the way in which this has been a force in American politics on religious grounds is one I think that has been seriously underestimated. And it's why I must say I particularly rejoice that when I look at the electronic site of the Democratic Socialists of America, I notice that they specifically have a religious publication. And some of it involves figures of the past, like Rauschenbusch, and some of it engagements of those who understand the continuing presence of a religious impetus in the work of people such as Martin Luther King and more recently Jesse Jackson. Part of this issue of why the revolution for agency has stalled, I think, goes back to what Frederick Denison Morris said, namely that there was a feeling, rather interestingly, after the successful civil rights movement in this country, leading up to the Great Society programs of voting rights and public accommodations, was, it seems to me, historically speaking, a rather surprising change. And I think one reason it occurred was that there was an extremely powerful alliance between progressive political forces and the religious opinion, not only of Martin Luther King, but of the enthusiastic mainline churches that supported the civil rights movement. Interestingly, after that success, the tendency of progressive political movements was to portray Christianity as being a reactionary force, instead of understanding its importance as an ally for the change. With the result that by the end of the 1960s, you see them going their very separate ways. One interesting index of this, the word liberation itself. Liberation is used, initially speaking, in liberation theology. But watch what happens when I then use the phrase women's liberation. When I say women's liberation, you immediately don't think of it as a religious movement. Why has that occurred? Something went on during the 1960s that caused a bifurcation of what had been natural allies, until the point now that many progressives think of the denial of religion as being a necessary part of any kind of progress. What if that is exactly wrong? What if the fact is that the only motivation you will ever discover for people to act against their self-interests, which is what you always must do for the sake of progress, you must convince people that their self-interest should not be in the command of their actions. That is called religion. That is what religion routinely does. And it can certainly be misused, there's no doubt about that, when its capacity for people to look beyond themselves becomes distorted towards a bad end. That has occurred, that will occur, no doubt. But that doesn't mean that, therefore, this aspect of human behavior can wisely be ignored by those who are engaged in the whole process of change. Yes, please, the cantor.
It's fascinating what you're saying. As someone who participated in the civil rights movement in Mississippi and went down as a atheist, a lot of young people were secular atheists and coming from churches or synagogues. And it was amazing to me, I don't know for anybody else, that all the songs of freedom were church songs. And instead of saying, woke up this morning with my mind on Jesus, we say, woke up this morning with my mind on freedom. Now, that would go to the either or. Jesus, freedom, Jesus. You know, I don't think, I still have to quite resolve that. So, who's the famous, in the 20th century, theologian dealt with social liberation?
Well, you might be thinking of Reinhold Niebuhr or Paul Tillich. You're thinking of Niebuhr? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Niebuhr is a very important figure. However, he also has a vital role to play in the way in which confidence in the idea of a revolution for agency began to decline in the United States. One reason for its decline was entirely practical. Walter Rauschenbusch writes in 1908, prior to the First World War, the First World War is seen by many people in Europe and in the United States as being a profound challenge to any kind of view of progress. Can you really say that we are better right now given what we do with our industrial capacities. And that experience of the First World War, let us face it, did not improve during the course of the 20th century. It began to seem, if you looked at the Second World War, the rise of the Third Reich, as you looked at the enormous power of the Soviet Union, that history was not basically a field of progress. I mean, right, this is the way Edwards and Morris and Rauschenbusch saw it. History is a field of progress. But now, in the light of the 20th century's wars and what's associated with those wars, the extermination camps, both in Germany and in the Soviet Union, one begins to see history more as a Manichaean field, more as a place where evil is much as at work as good. And so there emerged, and this was a direct consequence of the First World War, a reaction that was known as neo-orthodoxy. And in the understanding of neo-orthodoxy, especially as articulated by Karl Barth, the understanding was that actually human beings have much less agency for good than you thought. And that this capacity for good can only be found in God. There's less confidence in the idea of people as they are in the image and likeness of God, and instead an emphasis on the way in which people have to be redeemed if they are to acquire anything positive out of this image. Barth's thinking very deeply affected Reinhold Niebuhr. And he specifically applied this to the issue of the practice of politics in the United States, and distanced himself from figures such as Martin Luther King, who are more aligned with the inheritance of Rauschenbusch. That's the reason for which, although I'm very interested with the new vogue for reading Reinhold Niebuhr, I actually think he's very interesting and good theologian, but often it is not appreciated that he's also a pessimist, and that a pessimist about seeing the human being not in the image and likeness of God yet, having to be redeemed before you can speak that language. Edwards and Milton would not agree. Edwards and Milton would say, even an evil person is in the image and likeness of God. The 20th century begins to develop the thought, and this is part of the pushback, begins to develop the thought that only the redeemed are in the image and likeness of God. And how do you know you are redeemed? Oh, that would be because you agree with me. And notice something. While this theological tendency is being played out, and let me say, I do not wish in any way to suggest that Niebuhr did this consciously. I think he was reacting to the conditions of his time with the Reformed theology he had at his disposal, but it had an impact. The impact is you come to take back some of the celebration of agency which had been a part of Edwards's revolution. And you contain this idea of who's an agent to a very select group of people. That thought process has also influenced the interpretation of the American Constitution. Since rights and liberties enumerated by the Constitution are in our time increasingly limited to people who are described as citizens. That is, you have freedom of the press, you have the right of habeas corpus if you're an American citizen. But if you're not an American citizen, and if you are, for example, an enemy combatant, we can hold you in custody for as long as we want, without a charge, without a trial. How can we think that way? That is not the way Thomas Jefferson thought, right? There's no such thing as a passport as we understand it in the time of Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson thought citizenship is if you live there. So how can you restrict that notion? And the answer is you do so by redefining all the rights and liberties to a group that you are able to determine. That happened theologically before it happened legally. And that is one mark of the way in which we are caught in a moment of collision between two ideologies, both of which emerge out of the Puritan legacy in the United States. Most practitioners don't know that. That is, many people who are applying the legal standard I just referred to don't understand that in fact its background was theological. Likewise, many progressives arguing, let's say, in relation to a full gender neutrality in the law, don't see that John Milton was their daddy. It would be a shocking thought to most of them. And yet, that clearly is the case. So I am arguing that they would better understand themselves, and perhaps also better be able to come to a common understanding as to how to apply their principles if they knew where their principles came from. And for the most part, they do not. Yes, please. That's exactly right. This is a good question about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, because he is himself a torn figure. He stands very much in what I would describe as a Reformed Lutheran tradition. That is, although he's a Lutheran, he thinks along the lines of Calvin. He clearly writes in a work that he actually produced when he was in prison, in the Ethics, he clearly writes that a nation has the power to determine the religion that should be in that nation. He's writing that while he's a prisoner. He's returned to Germany from the United States. He could have stayed at Union Seminary in New York City. Instead, he decides what the German people are going through, I have to go through. In Germany, he also supports those who want to overthrow Hitler, although he's just said that the government has the right to determine religion. But in the Ethics, he doesn't defend himself, but he explains himself. In the Ethics, he said, yes, the government has the right to do that, but I have the freedom of conscience to be able to resist, provided I'm prepared to accept the consequences of my resistance. And the Nazis hung him just as the Allies were invading. A simple act of vengeance. So he was someone, I believe, who was coming to a very interesting resolution of this collision between two kinds of theology. A status quo theology, which says, yes, the government has the power, and an agentive understanding that says, I have a responsibility. I think if he had survived the war, he would have been the perfect discussion partner for Reinhold Niebuhr. But of course, bear in mind, he was put to death young. Well, as theologians go. You know, theologians don't mature until most people are retiring. So he, was just beginning to come to the point where he's grappling with exactly the issue I'm referring to when he was put to death. And I am not put to death, but I am put silent by the Cardinal of Red Hook. So thank you very much for coming. I'll be around for a bit. Good, good. Is she here?
She should be.
Yeah.
Teresa, could you come forward at this
Teresa,
time?
we need you.
Teresa's the one that runs the organization, actually. She constantly keeps us both in line and other people. And
If
Teresa,
someone keeps you in line?
try. But anyway, she's been here for 35 years, and she's been, quote, let loose into the world. And she's looking for a job. If anybody knows, she's an excellent secretary, unfortunately, because she keeps pushing us all around and getting us to where we're going, but she's a great person. And she's been very faithful. And so we have a little gift for you here as a remembrance of just your wonderful service here to us. And Bruce can finish up with saying a few words.
It's quite true. Teresa has kept us in such order as we are in. We now announce that we'll be out of order for the foreseeable future. It's been wonderful to know her, to share her faith, to share her dedication. It's more than a matter of someone being loyal. It's a matter of someone being fully connected with our work. And for that, we are extremely grateful, Teresa. Thank you.
Teresa?
It's been very good to hear Bruce's lectures and all of you people coming and all of your kindness, and it was enjoyable at lunchtime. I didn't make it today, but I just appreciate all of you and thank you. And I wish I could still be here, but that's not possible.
Thank you.
Hopefully you can all say a prayer, if you do any prayers, that I can find a job.
Yeah, that's the next goal for her. We got to find a job for her. So if you know any contacts, secretary, excellent secretary, organizer. This is her best example right here. Thank you.
Thank you.